The first 911 call came from a neighbor of Professor Alan Thorne, who lived in the quiet western section of Princeton. The woman was alarmed by muffled groans coming from the large Victorian mansion where the professor had been leading a reclusive life since the loss of his wife. The officers who arrived at the scene expected to find a clear problem, but Thorne met them with no apparent concern and explained that he had tried to identify the source of the sound several times. He suggested that animals might have gotten into the old ventilation system of the house. The officers inspected the area around the mansion, checked the windows and ventilation shafts, but the inspection yielded no results. The house looked calm, and the police did not notice any alarming signs. Given that the professor had no prior history with law enforcement and had never had conflicts with his neighbors, the police decided to close the call without further investigation. Nevertheless, complaints from neighbors continued for several more months throughout 2020. Gradually, law enforcement stopped taking them seriously, attributing them to household causes or the excessive anxiety of the neighborhood residents. Apart from the strange noises, there were no other grounds for concern. This continued until the fall of 2023, when a routine social services check uncovered suspicious financial transactions related to Professor Thorne. Now, the police returned to the professor's house on suspicion of fraud, armed with an official search warrant. Just a few minutes into the search, the officers realized that a much more disturbing and complicated story was hidden behind Thorne's previous explanations. To the residents of the western section, Alan Thorne was a man beyond reproach. Anyone who knew the professor even slightly could confirm. Thorne was a renowned scientist in his field, a respected specialist in neurolinguistics working at Princeton University. Students spoke of him positively, and colleagues valued his professionalism and high moral standards. For many years, Thorne had led a conventional life. He taught, published scientific articles, and participated in conferences. Everything seemed calm and successful, but in recent years, his life had changed dramatically. In 2019, his son Leo suffered a severe accident and was placed in a medical center in a deep coma. A year later, another loss occurred. The professor's wife, Eleonora, was in a car accident and did not survive. Colleagues noted that after this, Thorne began to avoid socializing, almost ceased contact with others, and was rarely seen at the university outside of his mandatory lectures. The neighborhood residents grew accustomed to the professor's reclusive lifestyle. He rarely left his large Victorian house, avoided all events, and hardly ever received guests. His neighbors understood the terrible blows of fate he had endured, and did not ask unnecessary questions, trying not to disturb him. When complaints about strange sounds coming from his house began to surface, the neighbors reacted with disbelief. No one could imagine that anything suspicious could be happening with a man who had lost his closest family members and lived in complete solitude. The professor's explanation about animals or household noises was perceived as quite reasonable, and over time, the sounds ceased to bother the residents. Thus, by the fall of 2023, the image of Alan Thorne in the eyes of those around him was firmly established, a quiet, respected man, silently enduring a personal tragedy. The police reappeared at the professor's house for a different reason, to investigate suspicious financial transactions. What the officers discovered in the house during this search was completely at odds with the familiar, quiet lifestyle Thorne had established over the years. The check that marked a new turn in this story initially seemed completely routine. Social services employees regularly reconcile data, conduct random checks, and request documents to confirm the accuracy of payments. Such procedures are usually quick and formal, especially when dealing with people who do not arouse suspicion. This time, inspectors noticed checks being issued in the name of Eleanora Thorne, the professor's wife. Eleanora had a confirmed diagnosis following a stroke in 2018, and since then, the family had been receiving monthly disability payments. All this time, the money was regularly cashed, and no questions about its use were raised. The payments were standard and were reviewed on a scheduled basis every few years without additional requests. But by the fall of 2023, the department had launched a large-scale data reconciliation program covering all long-standing social benefit cases, especially those where documents had not been updated for a long time or fresh reports from recipients had not been received. It was this scheduled procedure that caused employees to take notice of her checks 3 years after the tragedy with Eleanora was announced. At first, it looked like a simple technical error. According to official records, Eleanora Thorne had died in a car crash back in 2020, a fact known to almost all her acquaintances and neighbors. But when an official confirmation of her death was requested, it turned out that no such documents existed. Professor Thorne had not provided a death certificate, a police report, or any medical papers about the incident. The professor had indeed explained to acquaintances that the funeral had taken place in another state, where Eleanora grew up, and that the paperwork was delayed due to bureaucratic difficulties. The department, in turn, had no reason to re-verify this information earlier, as the payments were standard and did not require annual confirmation as long as the recipient was listed as alive and the checks were cashed on time. The residents of the area and family acquaintances also did not think about the lack of documents, as they believed the professor's words. No one wanted to disturb a man going through a profound personal loss, much less ask him to show papers about his wife's death. This delicacy became an additional reason why the discrepancies surfaced so late. Now, however, as part of the general review, the situation looked completely different. The inspectors could no longer ignore this fact. The absence of supporting documents and the regular receipt of payments after the supposed tragedy left no room for a simple explanation. Social services handed the case file over to the police, asking them to investigate the circumstances and determine where the money had been going all this time. The police took the case calmly, a routine financial check, of which there were many each year. None of the officers even remembered the complaints about strange sounds from Thorne's house a few years earlier. For the police at that moment, it was just a standard situation involving financial formalities, usually resolved with a single visit and clarification of documents. But what the officers saw upon crossing the threshold of the professor's house made them realize almost immediately that they were facing not just a financial misunderstanding, but a case far more grim and disturbing. When the police arrived at Professor Thorne's house, they viewed the visit as a formal procedure to check financial documents. The officers expected nothing unusual. A standard check that any police officer was accustomed to. Thorne met them calmly, without a hint of anxiety or irritation. The professor politely invited the officers inside, led them to a spacious study, and calmly offered to let them inspect any documents they were interested in. He remained reserved, answered clearly, and made no attempt to evade the topic. This behavior immediately convinced the police that Thorne had nothing to hide. Experienced officers were used to quickly distinguishing liars from truth-tellers, and right now, everything seemed completely normal. The professor's study was in perfect order. Thorne pointed to a cabinet where checks and bank statements were kept, and began to calmly explain the situation with the payments in Eleanora's name. He repeated the familiar explanation. The tragedy had happened in another state, the funeral was held there, and the paperwork was significantly delayed. The money, he said, he was keeping and intended to return as soon as the issues with the documents were settled. One of the officers carefully examined the checks, comparing the signatures. There was no doubt. Each check bore Professor Thorne's own signature. Thus, the violation was formally confirmed. Disability payments were regularly issued in Eleanora Thorne's name and personally cashed by the professor after, by his own account, she was already deceased. The officer was just about to discuss the discovered evidence with his partner and conclude the visit when a muffled groan, clearly audible in the quiet of the study, came from the depths of the house. The officer froze, listening and trying to understand where the unusual sound was coming from. Thorne noticed the change in the officer's demeanor and repeated his explanation about the ventilation, but this time more briefly and less convincingly. However, the officer was barely listening. He stepped into the hallway, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Intuitively, the officer felt that the sound was clearly human and had nothing to do with household malfunctions. The second officer followed his colleague, noticing his concern and also listening intently. The sound came again, this time louder and clearer. It was obvious that it was coming from somewhere upstairs. Looking up, the officers saw an old staircase leading to the attic. Officially, they had no grounds to check other rooms, but their intuition and experience told them that it was impossible to ignore this sound. One of the officers turned on his flashlight and began to slowly climb the stairs. The wooden steps creaked quietly under his feet, and the strange sound repeated again. Now there was no doubt. Upon reaching the top, the officer saw a heavy door with a simple latch. He easily slid it aside, and the door gave way immediately. The attic looked ordinary: old boxes, some furniture, and various household clutter. But the officer's attention was immediately drawn to an unusual detail. Soundproofing panels were neatly fixed along the walls, with wires extending from them deeper into the room. Taking a few more steps inside, the officer again heard the now familiar sound, a soft, plaintive groan that was distinctly human and now sounded very close. He moved cautiously further toward the back wall where the wires led, feeling the tension inside him build. Downstairs, Professor Thorne continued to stand calmly, watching the police's actions without any visible concern. He did not even attempt to stop the officers, as if he were confident they would find nothing upstairs. But the officer in the attic already understood clearly that what was happening went far beyond a simple financial violation. He was approaching the back wall, and what he saw in the next second made him completely reconsider his perception of the entire case. When the officer reached the far wall of the attic, he immediately noticed an old ventilation shaft. It was through this shaft, despite Professor Thorne's attempts to install soundproofing panels, that the sound was escaping freely. Thorne himself sincerely believed that his work eliminated any possibility of sound leakage and therefore never checked the ventilation further. Amidst the medical equipment and wires, the officer noticed a heavy door with a padlock. Unlike the walls, the door was ordinary, with no soundproofing whatsoever. Moving closer, the officer listened and immediately heard a muffled human groan coming from the room. It became clear that the room was not empty, and someone inside needed urgent help. An attempt to break the lock himself failed, and the officer immediately went downstairs to report to his partner. Returning to the study, he met the professor's gaze. Thorne was still standing perfectly still, staring out the window. But now his outward composure looked suspicious. It was clear that he had realized the seriousness of the situation, and that events were no longer unfolding according to his plan. The investigation would later reveal that Thorne did not open the door voluntarily, not out of fear of exposure, but because he genuinely believed his actions were justified and lawful. To him, opening the door himself would have been an admission of guilt, which he did not feel. When asked by the detective about the locked room, Thorne stated, briefly and without emotion, that he knew exactly who was upstairs and that he was holding the person there consciously. His answer was ambiguous, leaving it open to interpretation as an expression of emotional attachment or as an admission of literal confinement. Professor Thorne now became the primary suspect for the police. One of the officers stayed with him, while the detective returned to the attic to inspect the room in detail before the technical team arrived. A second inspection confirmed the initial impression. The room was meticulously outfitted with medical equipment, and the wires and sensors were professionally installed and connected to the locked door. This indicated that the person behind the door was not just anyone, but someone who was part of a carefully planned experiment. The technical team, which arrived a few minutes later, quickly broke the lock. The door swung open, revealing a small room filled with medical devices. On a bed in the center of the room lay a person connected to numerous machines and cables. This discovery completely changed the course of the investigation. The police were now dealing not with a bureaucratic error, but with a case that turned out to be far more serious than they had initially presumed. As soon as the attic door was opened and the sounds of footsteps and officers' voices came from above, Professor Thorne's behavior changed abruptly. He clearly realized that the police had entered his secret room and immediately tried to hurry toward the stairs leading up, as if to interfere with what was happening. The second officer, who had remained nearby, instantly blocked his path, noticing the professor's sudden agitation. Thorne stubbornly insisted that the police's intrusion into the attic was unacceptable, citing his right to privacy and the sanctity of the premises. His behavior no longer seemed merely suspicious, but desperate. He repeated the same thing over and over, as if trying to convince not only the officers, but also himself of his righteousness. The police quickly understood that the professor's behavior indicated that there was indeed a person in danger upstairs. Any attempt by the homeowner to stop the search in such a situation only reinforced the need for immediate police action. Therefore, the officers acted quickly and cohesively, carefully moving Thorne aside and preventing him from going up the stairs. Once the professor realized that resistance was futile, he stopped arguing and sat down on the nearest chair. He now watched the proceedings in silence, completely withdrawn into himself. His expression no longer showed aggression or panic, rather a deep realization that he could no longer change anything. Meanwhile, upstairs, the police and the technical team carefully examined the room. On the bed lay a woman whom the detectives immediately recognized as Eleanora Thorne. All the equipment was functional and meticulously calibrated, and Eleanora's condition appeared stable, although she was unresponsive. The police immediately called for medical assistance, understanding that the top priority now was to get the woman to a hospital. The medical team arrived promptly and quickly prepared Eleanora for transport. Professor Thorne, sitting downstairs under police watch, no longer reacted to what was happening and seemed completely detached. Later in the investigation, it would become clear that his desperate resistance had been a final attempt to protect what he considered his duty and right, not a fear of being exposed. The police were no longer conducting a formal check of financial documents. After the discovery of Eleonora, the case of Professor Alan Thorne moved into an entirely different realm. The officers realized they had to unravel not just a bureaucratic violation, but a carefully concealed secret that was far more serious and complex than it had initially appeared. After Eleonora was taken to the hospital, investigators began a detailed inspection of the attic. It was immediately obvious that this was not an ordinary room for caring for a sick person, but something akin to an experimental laboratory. In addition to life support medical devices, the room was equipped with special acoustic technology, clearly intended for recording. On Thorne's desk was a computer with an archive of audio files. Investigators quickly found dozens of folders labeled with dates and notes, spanning a period of almost 3 years. Nearly all the files contained short audio clips, faint groans, intermittent breathing, and periodic noises that the professor had logged as his wife's reactions to various external stimuli. A medical examination confirmed Eleonora's diagnosis, locked-in syndrome. In this condition, a patient is fully conscious but unable to move or make voluntary sounds. All the groans and breathing noises recorded by the professor were involuntary reactions of her body to external stimuli like light, touch, or sound. A deeper examination of the equipment revealed that the microphones were connected not only to the computer, but also to an amplifier directed straight into the ventilation shaft. This shaft acted as a kind of resonator, amplifying and transmitting the sounds outside. This was exactly what the neighbors had been hearing for 3 years, without understanding the source of the disturbing noises. To the logical question of why Thorne, known for his meticulousness, allowed such an obvious flaw in the system, the investigation provided a convincing answer. The professor was absolutely confident in the reliability of the soundproofing he had installed. After the initial setup, he never once checked the ventilation shaft, fully trusting his own calculations and believing that no sound could escape the room. What mattered to him was the recording itself, not its external dissemination. Nevertheless, the very fact that the professor scrupulously saved and analyzed even minor physiological noises from Eleonora indicated that he was engaged in something more than just medical care. From his lab journals, it became clear that Thorne saw these audio recordings as a key to possibly communicating with his wife. He documented reactions to music, visual stimuli, and touch, and analyzed the sound responses, trying to find signs of conscious reaction in them. However, investigators found no confirmation that Eleonora was actually responding to the stimuli in a meaningful way. Everything suggested that the professor was interpreting random sounds and changes in breathing as deliberate communication attempts that did not actually exist. Thus, the situation grew even more complex. The professor was not hiding Eleonora or trying to make others think she didn't exist. He lied about her death, not to shut himself off from the world, but rather to continue his experiment peacefully without interference from social services or the police. Now the investigation faced a new, much more difficult task. It was necessary to understand what exactly Professor Thorne was trying to prove, why he so persistently made recordings, and why he failed to notice the obvious sound leakage from his house. Specialists in neurolinguistics and psychology became interested in the case to provide some explanation for the actions of a professor who spent 3 years recording meaningless noises in an attempt to turn them into coherent speech. During the initial inspection of the laboratory, One of the officers heard a quiet electrical hum from behind an adjacent wall. The sound resembled the low drone of a running device. The door to this room was slightly ajar and had not previously attracted attention, so the detectives decided to check it immediately. Inside was a small room, lit only by the dim screens of medical monitors. In the center stood a hospital bed with connected equipment, on which an unconscious young man lay motionless. It was not immediately possible to identify him. There were no documents nearby, and the room lacked any photographs or other identifying features. The police carefully documented the scene and called for medical specialists. While waiting for the medics, one of the detectives inspected a cabinet near the equipment and found a folder with documents from a private hospice. The documents bore the name of Leo Thorne, who had been discharged 3 years earlier into his father's personal care. The professor had submitted a written refusal of further medical supervision, stating that he had sufficient resources to provide quality care at home. At that moment, the police had only made a preliminary assessment of the situation. They photographed the wires and speakers connecting Leo's room to the adjacent room where they had previously found Eleonora. But a full understanding of the meaning of this connection would come much later. Over the next few days, technical specialists and forensic experts conducted a detailed examination of the entire equipment system. They determined that the microphones recording Eleonora's sounds were directly connected to speakers in Leo's room. The audio signal was broadcast around the clock, creating a constant background sound in the room. Only after a laboratory analysis of the computer equipment, which took several days, did it become clear that Professor Thorne was meticulously recording and studying Leo's reactions to these sound stimuli. His lab journals contained detailed records of physiological changes, such as breathing, heart rate, and brain activity, which Thorne believed could indicate the recovery of his son's consciousness. A detailed examination of the professor's medical documentation also revealed why no medics had checked on Leo's condition after his discharge. Thorne regularly sent false reports to the hospice about his son's stable condition. These documents did not raise suspicion because, formally, everything looked convincing, and no checks were required by law. Thus, the findings in the attic, which at first seemed like a shocking discovery, gradually formed a meticulously planned system. Investigators realized that the professor had been conducting an experiment for years, connecting mother and son with a sound system. He believed that continuous audio stimulation with his mother's voice could awaken Leo's consciousness. The police now had all the necessary evidence to confirm the strange experiment. But the most important task lay ahead: to understand Professor Thorne's true motives and what he had hoped to achieve through his actions. To understand Professor Thorne's true motives, the investigation brought in an independent specialist in the field of neurobiology. It was important to determine what goal Thorne was pursuing by organizing such a system and how scientifically sound his actions were. The consultant on the case was Dr. Stephen Harris, a reputable neurobiologist known for his research on consciousness in patients in comatose and vegetative states. After carefully studying the case materials, he explained to the police that the professor's actions could not be dismissed as pure madness, as they were based on a real, albeit highly controversial, scientific hypothesis. Dr. Harris explained that, according to some modern research, the human brain in a deep coma retains a certain level of activity, especially in areas related to memory and emotion. It is believed that emotional signals, such as the voice of a loved one, or specific sounds associated with emotional experiences, can potentially affect these brain regions and even stimulate the awakening of consciousness. This was precisely the hypothesis, in Harris's opinion, that Thorne was trying to test. The professor believed that the emotionally charged sounds of the mother, even her involuntary breathing signals and groans, could be perceived by Leo's brain and trigger the awakening of his consciousness. An examination of Thorne's journals confirmed that the professor approached the task systematically, using a methodology resembling scientific research. These records, entered into the case as physical evidence, showed how meticulously Thorne documented all changes in Leo's physiological indicators: brain activity, heart rate, and breathing. He compared reactions to different types of sounds and diligently searched for patterns, convinced that the method he had found could work. However, the expert emphasized that despite all the professor's scientific rhetoric, his method was not approved by any official research and completely contradicted medical practice. From a neurobiological standpoint, such experiments could have a serious negative impact on the patient's nervous system, and their effectiveness had never been proven. Thus, the investigation reached an important conclusion. The professor did not act spontaneously or impulsively. He carefully planned his steps, fully aware of their consequences, and was convinced of the righteousness of his idea. This realization seriously complicated the subsequent investigation, as it now had to be determined whether Thorne's actions were the result of a distorted perception of reality caused by personal tragedy, or if behind the scientific mask hid the cold, rational calculation of a man who had crossed all ethical boundaries. 4 weeks after the discovery of the hidden rooms in Professor Thorne's house, investigators returned to speak with residents of the neighboring homes. By that time, the police had completed their initial forensic examinations and had enough information to understand what the neighbors had been hearing for the past 3 years. Previously, the local residents had adhered to a single, common version based on the professor's own explanations. He had assured them that all the extraneous noises regularly coming from his house were caused by a faulty ventilation system or worn-out pipes. Thorne was so convincing and calm that people had no doubts about his words and saw no reason to contact the police or take other action. However, after the official police announcement about what was found inside the house, the neighbors finally realized the true nature of those sounds. They were not household noises or technical malfunctions. People living just feet away had, for 3 years, been unwitting witnesses to what was happening inside the house. Many now experienced severe psychological discomfort, realizing they should have paid closer attention to the situation. Investigators specifically organized a second round of interviews with the neighbors to rule out any possible complicity or even awareness of the professor's actions by others. They investigated theories that someone might have seen strangers regularly visiting the house, or that Thorne had assistants. However, no evidence was found to support these assumptions. The residents of the street confirmed that Professor Thorne had always avoided personal contact and close conversations. He limited his interactions to a minimal level, maintaining polite but distant relationships. This allowed him to effectively conceal the true picture of what was happening in his home. By the end of the 4th week of the investigation, all alternative versions and secondary hypotheses had been completely ruled out. No evidence of third-party involvement was found. The police came to the final conclusion that the only person responsible for organizing and conducting the secret experiment was Professor Alan Thorne. It was on him that all the efforts and attention of law enforcement were now focused. To fully understand Professor Thorne's motives, investigators began a deep dive into his biography. They needed to understand how a successful and respected scientist could be capable of actions that contradicted not only ethics, but also basic human logic. However, a detailed examination of Thorne's past revealed nothing that could directly point to cruelty or pathological tendencies. On the contrary, his entire life seemed to be an example of a perfect academic career. Thorne had successfully graduated from university, quickly built a scientific career, became a respected professor, and regularly published articles that generated interest in the scientific community. On the surface, his biography appeared flawless. But when investigators spoke with people who knew Thorne well, a very different picture emerged. Almost everyone who worked with him at the university noted his outstanding intellect, deep knowledge, and professionalism, but also his difficult, authoritarian character. According to one colleague, Thorne was always convinced of the absolute correctness of his own opinion. His confidence often bordered on overconfidence and created difficulties in his relationships with others. In a conversation with doctors from the hospice where Thorne had taken his son Leo, additional details came to light. The medical staff explained that 3 years prior, they had strongly recommended that the professor leave Leo at the facility, explaining that the young man needed continuous professional monitoring. However, Thorne ignored these recommendations, telling the doctors that his own method would be more effective. He was adamant in his decision, even rejecting an offer for additional consultations with specialists. A review of Thorne's scientific publications showed that he had long been engaged in research that drew mixed reactions from the scientific community. His hypotheses were unconventional and often sharply diverged from mainstream views. When his ideas were criticized, Thorne usually ignored the remarks and continued to work in his own direction, becoming even more entrenched in his own correctness. Psychologists brought in by investigators to assess the professor's actions pointed out that Thorne's behavior was rooted in a so-called savior complex. This is a psychological state in which a person is convinced of their unique ability to solve the problems of their loved ones. The experts concluded that the professor had no intention of harming anyone. Instead, he was genuinely convinced that only his own approach could help Leo return to a full life. It was this confidence and his scientific ambitions that drove him to act, completely disregarding medical and moral norms. The psychologists also drew the investigators' attention to the fact that Thorne saw his experiment as a chance to make a significant scientific breakthrough. He wanted to prove that his methods were better than traditional medicine, and that his critics were wrong. As a result, he was willing to disregard any limitations and moral norms to obtain proof of his correctness. Thus, a complete picture of Professor Thorne's motivation was revealed to the investigators. His actions did not involve sadism or cruelty for its own sake. Everything that happened was the result of his profound distortion of reality, caused by an absolute conviction in his own rightness and the significance of his idea. Now, the investigation had to determine whether the professor was capable of accepting responsibility for his actions, or if he would continue to defend his position to the very end, despite all the evidence presented. On December 14, 2023, Alan Thorne voluntarily came to the Princeton police station for an official interrogation. By this time, the police had already gathered all the necessary case materials, including medical reports, financial documents, and the professor's lab journals. Despite the severity of the accusations, Thorne was not arrested, as he had not previously obstructed the investigation, had no criminal record, and had not attempted to flee. For the duration of the investigation, he was released under a travel restriction. Investigators began the interrogation by discussing the most serious aspect of the case, the risk to Eleonora's and Leo's lives. Thorne was explained in detail the danger his loved ones were in due to the lack of professional care. According to experts, Eleonora's condition required round-the-clock medical supervision and regular care from qualified personnel. Leo was entirely dependent on medical equipment, the slightest malfunction of which could have had tragic consequences. Thorne, however, firmly stated to the investigators that the risks were minimal and that he was constantly in control of the situation. The investigators presented the professor with his own lab journals seized from his home. Thorne confirmed the authenticity of the documents and immediately began to defend his position, explaining that he had acted solely in the best interests of his family. He continued to insist that he was conducting a serious scientific experiment, and that his methods were the only hope for restoring Leo's consciousness. The interrogation then moved to the financial accusations. The police presented the professor with official bank documents and statements from the Social Security Administration. According to them, Thorne had, for several years, regularly cashed disability checks intended for Eleonora, who at the same time was believed to be deceased. It was these suspicious financial transactions that had initially attracted the authorities' interest and led to the criminal case. The professor confirmed receiving the money, but denied any fraudulent intent. He claimed that these funds were necessary to provide for the conditions of the experiment and the care of his loved ones, not a source of personal gain. When investigators demanded Thorne explain how he managed to hide Eleonora for several years and why government agencies had not requested documents of her death, the professor revealed the details of his scheme. Immediately after her stroke, he had officially taken Eleonora from the hospital under his own responsibility, exercising his legal right as a spouse to provide home care. He then informed his colleagues and acquaintances that Eleonora had died in a car crash outside the U.S. Thorne explained the absence of documents by citing bureaucratic difficulties in another country, thereby eliminating any questions from those around him. As for government agencies, Eleonora was formally listed as alive because Thorne had never filed any official notification of her death. The Social Security Administration continued to automatically issue payments without conducting additional checks, as formally nothing raised suspicion. Because Eleonora's severe condition prevented her from interacting with the outside world, the authorities had no reason to doubt her situation and did not schedule additional reviews, allowing the professor to use the money for 3 years without any hindrance. The detectives emphasized that Thorne had systematically misled government agencies by forging Eleonora's signatures and concealing her true condition. The professor did not deny these actions, but still considered them justified in the context of his experiment. In conclusion, the investigators reminded Thorne that his actions violated both legal norms and basic moral principles. The professor acknowledged the factual circumstances, but completely denied their criminality. At the end of the interrogation, he confirmed all the facts presented by the investigation, but expressed disagreement with the legal interpretation of his actions. Professor Thorne's case was fully prepared for trial. It would be up to the New Jersey State Court to make a final assessment of his actions and deliver a verdict, determining the extent of his responsibility for what he had done. The investigation had reached a crucial stage. The main issue was to prove that Alan Thorne had acted not merely out of delusion, but had consciously and intentionally caused Eleonora's suffering. The question of intent arose after it became clear that the professor's lawyers planned to build their defense around his supposedly good intentions and scientific goals. Investigators needed to irrefutably prove that Thorne understood the consequences of his experiments and knowingly ignored the pain and discomfort he was inflicting on Eleonora. This is why the investigation returned to a reanalysis of the lab journals, which had initially been viewed solely as scientific documentation. During the first review of these documents, no one had paid much attention to the minor details, perceiving them as standard records. However, upon closer examination, investigators and experts saw a completely different picture. Professor Thorne's journals contained detailed descriptions of Eleonora's reactions to stimuli he specifically selected, photos of Leo, video recordings, and audio clips. The professor recorded the reactions with second-by-second precision, carefully noting the emotional response and duration of each negative reaction, which was accompanied by crying or expressions of clear discomfort. These records were first perceived as a standard observation procedure, but it was now clear that the professor was fully aware of the painfulness of the stimuli he was using. Psychological experts confirmed the investigation's conclusions. The repeated occurrence of the same negative result indicated Thorne's complete awareness of the consequences of his actions. The specialists emphasized that such actions could in no way be justified by good intentions or scientific goals. Such actions constitute the conscious infliction of suffering on a person unable to defend themselves. It became clear why the professor had so methodically kept his records, never doubting his own righteousness. He viewed these documents as scientific confirmation of his theories and did not anticipate that they would become the primary evidence against him. Thorne probably did not even realize that his scientific meticulousness had become proof of his criminal intent. When the investigators met again with the professor's defense team, they were forced to admit that the arguments about a scientific experiment no longer seemed convincing. The lawyers tried to focus on Thorne's emotional instability, but the psychological evaluation firmly rejected such an interpretation. The experts stated that Thorne was clearly aware of his actions and could not have been unaware of their consequences. After a further review of the materials, the investigation was finally convinced that they were dealing not with a mistake or a scientific delusion, but with the conscious and cruel infliction of pain. Professor Thorne's lab journals became the most critical evidence of intent. Now, the investigators were preparing to file the official indictment and transfer the case materials to the New Jersey State Court. The court would have to make the final decision on Alan Thorne's guilt and deliver a just sentence in a case that had shaken the entire city. Once investigators had proven the intentional nature of Professor Thorne's actions, a full understanding of the situation required knowing the severity of the consequences of his experiments for Eleonora and Leo. Until this point, the investigation had focused on the professor's motives and the ethical side of his actions. But the true medical condition of the victims themselves only became known after a thorough examination by doctors. Eleonora was examined first. The doctors who conducted the examination immediately noted the severity of her condition: extreme emaciation, severe dehydration, and numerous deep bed sores. The prolonged lack of proper care and medical supervision meant that any, even minor, infection could have irreversible consequences. According to the experts' conclusion, Eleonora was on the verge of a fatal outcome. The doctor's report was categorical. Without the timely intervention of the police, the woman would not have lived much longer. The experts specifically emphasized that Eleonora's condition required specialized medical care, which the professor had failed to provide. Instead, he subjected her to regular emotional and physical discomfort, worsening her already dire state. Each subsequent stimulus, as the medics determined, not only caused her suffering, but also exacerbated her overall physical and mental exhaustion. In other words, each new session of the experiment only pushed Eleonora closer to the point of no return. Leo was examined next. The professor claimed that all his actions were aimed solely at improving his son's condition. However, the medical examination completely refuted these claims. During the entire period Leo was under Thorne's home care, his condition had not improved in any way. Leo remained in a vegetative state, showed no signs of reaction to external stimuli, and demonstrated not even the slightest improvement in his medical indicators. Additionally, the doctors pointed out that the home equipment used by Thorne was not intended for long-term maintenance of a patient in such a state. Any accidental malfunction could have led to critical consequences, such as respiratory or cardiac failure. Without professional medical supervision and regular technical maintenance of the equipment, Leo's condition was extremely vulnerable. The medical conclusion stated unequivocally that Thorne's son had remained alive solely due to a fortunate turn of events, and not because of the professor's actions. In the final medical report, the experts clearly stated that Professor Thorne's so-called scientific experiments were completely useless from a medical standpoint. Moreover, they posed a direct and obvious threat to Eleonora's life and represented a huge risk for Leo. It became clear to the investigators that Thorne was conducting his experiment at the cost of the actual life and health of his loved ones. These findings completely stripped the professor and his defense of any ability to cite scientific necessity or good intentions. The medical facts obtained during the examinations were too convincing to leave any room for interpretation. Now, all that remained for the investigation was to prepare the official documents for transferring the case to court. There, the final verdict would be delivered on the punishment Professor Thorne would face for his actions. The investigators were left with the most important task: to connect all the lines of the investigation and present a complete, coherent picture of Professor Alan Thorne's actions. By this point, it was already clear that his actions could not be called a simple mistake or an attempt to help his family. The investigation had a clear chain of events that proved the intent and consciousness of Thorne's every step. The first important detail that launched the investigation was the constant crying that the neighbors regularly heard. Initially, the professor explained it as technical problems with the house, and those around him believed this version. But after Eleonora was discovered, it became obvious that the reason for the sounds was something entirely different. It was later revealed that these agonizing sounds were a central element of the professor's much more terrifying plan. The second key aspect was the financial side of the case. After Eleonora suffered a stroke, Thorne announced to friends and colleagues that she had passed away abroad. However, her death was not officially confirmed with documents, and Eleonora continued to be listed as alive. This allowed Thorne to consistently receive money intended for her medical care. However, the money allocated for regular professional care, medicine, and necessary procedures was spent differently. Instead of providing his wife with proper conditions and help, Thorne directed these funds toward purchasing specialized equipment needed to conduct his personal scientific experiments, which were useless from a medical standpoint and even dangerous for Leo. It was this misuse of funds that became the central part of the professor's fraud. The resources that the state allocated exclusively for maintaining Eleonora's health were spent on equipment not intended for treating her condition. Thus, her condition steadily deteriorated due to the lack of proper care, while the funds meant for her life and health were, in essence, financing a cruel and useless experiment. The third part of the investigation was the experiment on Leo itself. The professor was convinced that the sounds recorded from Eleonora would help bring Leo out of his vegetative state. He deliberately drove her to an agonizing emotional state, recording every painful sound and then broadcasting them to his son through audio devices. Experts determined that Thorne was fully aware of his wife's suffering, but continued to inflict pain on her to achieve his goals. The result of these actions was not an improvement in Leo's condition, but only a worsening of Eleonora's. After the investigators reconstructed the full timeline of events, there was no longer any doubt about the intentional nature of the professor's crimes. Thorne had consciously and methodically misled acquaintances, neighbors, and government agencies. By misusing the money allocated for Eleonora, he put her life at risk for the sake of a dubious experiment that yielded no medical results for Leo. Now, all the evidence was fully collected and documented. The investigators were finalizing the preparation of the materials, getting ready to officially hand over the case of Professor Alan Thorne to the court. It would be up to the court to make the final assessment and deliver a verdict on the man whose actions had long seemed incomprehensible and inexplicable to all who knew him. The trial of Professor Alan Thorne began on September 3, 2024, in the New Jersey District Court, and immediately attracted significant public attention. The hearings lasted exactly 4 weeks, concluding on October 1, 2024. In the courtroom, 2 versions of events clashed. The prosecution considered the professor's actions to be deliberate and arrogant, while the defense argued that everything that happened was the result of his profound grief and desperation. The prosecutor detailed all stages of the crime: financial fraud, deceiving the authorities, the confinement of Eleonora, and the experiments that nearly led to tragedy. The prosecution insisted that Thorne acted consciously and cynically, placing his scientific ambitions above the lives of his loved ones. The defense, in contrast, argued that the professor simply could not accept his son's and wife's illnesses. His lawyers called his actions the tragic mistake of a desperate man trying to save his family. The expert testimonies became key, confirming that the experiments had brought no benefit to Leo, but had caused severe harm to Eleonora. Psychologists stated that Thorne was aware of his actions and their consequences. The lab journal entries presented in court finally convinced the jury of the professor's guilt. In his final statement, Thorne did not apologize or show remorse, only speaking again of science and progress. After a brief deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. On October 1, 2024, the court imposed the sentence: 20 years in prison and a lifetime ban on teaching. The sentence was the final chapter in a case that shocked many and prompted reflection on how easily the line between care and cruelty can be crossed, and how the desire to help can turn into a tragedy. After the trial, attention to the case gradually faded, but the consequences were irreversible. Eleonora was immediately transferred to a specialized clinic after her rescue, but her body was already too weakened. 7 months later, she passed away. The cause of death, according to the medical report, was the severe conditions of her confinement. Leo was returned to the medical center, where he was once again monitored by professionals. His condition did not improve. His brain activity remained low, and no reactions were recorded. EEG readings taken after the experiment was stopped were too chaotic to confirm or deny the influence of his mother's vocal stimuli on his condition. Thorne's house was sealed and his property was sold off. The laboratory equipment remained only in photos and investigation documents. The name Alan Thorne became an example of how far a person can go when they are certain of their own righteousness and are willing to sacrifice the lives of loved ones to achieve their goals. However, experts were never able to definitively resolve the question of whether there was any meaning at all in his experiment.